Argentina is one of the greatest football nations in history. 3 World Cups and some of the greatest players to ever touch that ball. We all know this, and as we're watching the finale of the FIFA World Cup 2026, it makes us think a lot about Argentina. It is a country that millions admire every 4 years. But if you've ever wondered why so many Latinos have a complicated relationship with Argentina, well, we're going to answer that. Because it's not about football, it's about history. Because Argentina didn't just become one of South America's wealthiest nations. It consciously built an identity around becoming something else, something more European. And in the process, it reshaped the story it told about itself. So today, we're going to explore how that happened. And welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Laura Ray. On this channel, we talk about history, politics, culture, and how historical systems continue to shape the world we live in today. So today's conversation is not about attacking Argentinos. It's not about saying that every Argentino thinks the same way, because that's not true. No country is a monolith. Instead, we're going to examine one of the most fascinating and controversial questions in Latin American history. How did Argentina become known as the European country of Latin America? When most Latin American countries gained independence in the early 19th century, they faced the same question. What kind of nation are we going to become? In Argentina, many political thinkers believed the country's future depended on becoming as European as possible. One of the most influential figures was Domingo Faustino Sarmiento. Sarmiento famously believed that some were civilized and some were barbarians. For him, European institutions represented progress, and large parts of the indigenous frontier for him represented barbarianism and backwardness. His ideas were not unique, though. Many 19th century elite across Latin America admired Europe, including Porfirio Diaz. But Argentina embraced this vision very strongly. So political leaders encouraged massive European immigration. Millions of immigrants arrived from Italy, Spain, Germany, France, and other parts of Europe between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Immigration itself, though, wasn't the problem. Countries grow through immigration. We all know that. The question historians ask is much different. What happened to the people who were already there? Well, one of the defining moments in Argentina's nation building was the conquest of the desert in the late 19th century. This was a military campaign carried out primarily against indigenous people in La Patagonia and the Pampas. The Argentine government described it as bringing territory under the same state control, but historians and indigenous communities describe it as a campaign of violent dispossession. Some have even called it genocide. Thousands of indigenous people were killed, displaced, and forced into labor. Entire communities lost their ancestral lands. And today, many indigenous nations, including the Mapuche, Com, Huichi, Guarani, and Diaguita, continue to live in Argentina. But for generations, the dominant national story often portrayed Argentina as a country that had largely become European. Now, when it comes to Afro-Argentinos, many people outside of Argentina are surprised to learn that Buenos Aires once had the largest Afro-descendant population of all South America. So what happened? Well, the answer is more complicated than a single event, but historians do point to several overlapping factors. Wars during the 19th century, deadly epidemics including yellow fever, intermarriage, and the changing of census categories, and national narratives that increasingly emphasized European ancestry. So over time, Afro-Argentines became less visible, not because they disappeared entirely, but because the country's official story increasingly centered on whiteness and Europe. Today, Afro-Argentino organizations continue working to recover and preserve that history. Now, every nation tells stories about itself. France, Mexico, Japan, we all do. Argentina is no different, but historians have long argued that Argentina's national identity emphasized one story more than others. And of course, that story was that it was the most European nation of all Latin America. And that story appeared in immigration, policy, education, public memory, and cultural narratives. Now, of course, millions of Argentinos genuinely do have European ancestry, but another part of that ancestry and history includes indigenous people, Afro-descendant communities, and migrants from neighboring Latin American countries. So we're here talking about the World Cup in Argentina, and we all know that sports don't exist outside of history. Football becomes one of the biggest stages where national identity is performed. So for many fans across Latin America, debates about Argentina are not only about football, they're about history, and they are about colonialism and race and racism and belonging, and about the stories that become national stories and the other stories that just disappear. Now, that does not mean in any way that every Argentino shares the same views. That's actually far from it. There are many Argentinos who are historians, journalists, artists, indigenous leaders, and Afro-Argentino activists that have spent decades challenging these myths and expanding the country's historical memory. And their work absolutely deserves recognition. So we all know history is rarely simple, and Argentina is neither a villain nor a saint. It is a country with extraordinary cultural achievements and a deeply complex past. And understanding that complexity doesn't diminish Argentina. It actually enriches our understanding of Latin America as a whole. Because if we only celebrate their football victories while ignoring the histories that shaped our nations, we miss an opportunity to learn from one another. And again, it's not about assigning permanent guilt. It's about telling fuller stories. And perhaps one of the most important questions that we can ask any nation, including our own, is who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. So if you enjoyed this chat, go ahead and subscribe. And in the next episode, we're going to examine another chapter of Argentina's history and how debates over identity, memory, and race continue to shape politics and their culture today. So see you on the next one.